Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Next Door NetAdmin. At the tail end of last week's video about NAT hairpinning, I briefly mentioned split view DNS and how this was something that Microsoft was expecting people to implement. But I'm not entirely sure that everybody knows what split view or split brain DNS actually is. So I thought I'd touch on that and expand to consider a lot of the other things that you might need to keep in mind when you're planning a DNS deployment. So, really quickly before we dive into this, 10-second refresher. What is DNS? DNS is essentially the phone book for the internet. Ta-da! It's what translates your human-readable label of google.ca and takes that and translates it into a computer address that a computer can use to get you where you are wanting to go. That's basically it. But in a world of network address translation, or NAT, with IPv4, you have two sets of addresses. You have an external address and you have an internal address. And they're very different. In the time before NAT, everybody just had a publicly addressable address, and that was cool. And in the time after NAT of IPv6, there are enough IP addresses to go around. Your address can be globally reachable. You don't need network address translation anymore. And getting rid of NAT gets rid of a lot of the coping mechanisms that we had to implement to deal with things in the time of IPv4. And that's all they were coping mechanisms. There was no security about it. Having to do network address translation was used as a poor man's firewall, which is how it was called by a government auditor that I was working with for one client that needed to actually pass government security clearances. They said, do you have a proper firewall? Or are you using NAT as a poor man's firewall? Okay, well, I understand why you're asking that question. NAT's not security related. By its very nature, yes, it'll kind of prevent people from coming in unless you have a port forward, but it was never meant for security. NAT was a coping method. DNS split view or split brain DNS was also a coping mechanism. In a non-NAT world, you just have one IP address. It's globally reachable. You put it into DNS, great. Everybody, external and internal, can use the same address. It doesn't matter. But in a NAT world, as a coping mechanism, you need two sets of DNS, essentially. You need one with internal addresses, and you need one with external addresses. Your external addresses might be fairly limited. www, okay. Your email server, okay. Maybe a couple of others for other specific hosts, fine. Your internal typically had a lot more records because it has all of the computers. It has your domain controllers. It has your internal services. It has everything you need to make your domain function. And so that was a lot more extensive. But you could only have a single zone on a server. Okay, so Microsoft's traditional solution for this was to have two sets of DNS servers. You have one set that's internal, that is your domain controllers, and then you would have another set out in your DMZ where external clients could query them, and that's where you would have external addresses and just the external records. But this was two sets of servers to manage. It was not fabulous. In the Linux world, split view, which I have set up in Bind, was a different way. You could have two different zones for the same, you could have two different zone files for the same domain, essentially. And then you could use access control lists to say, hey, if people are coming from inside the network, answer their DNS queries from the internal zone with all the internal addresses. And if people are coming from outside the network, answer their queries from the external zone file with the external addresses. Then you have just one server. You do still have to remember to update both copies of the zone, but it's a single server, and it's less management to have to deal with a single server rather than having to remember to update two sets of servers in two different locations, internal and then in the DMZ. Microsoft eventually found their way around to including this as of Windows Server 2016, but it's, to my knowledge at least, it's not something that you can manage from within the GUI. It's entirely through PowerShell. If you have an Active Directory backed zone, you can add another zone scope for the same domain, and you can say this is for whatever purpose. You give it a name. External is descriptive, but it doesn't have to be called that. And then you can add records to it. And again, all the documentation shows this happening in PowerShell. I have not tested this myself, so I don't know for sure, but all the documentation says that creating this is done in PowerShell, creating records for it is done in PowerShell, and then you have to create policies to say, answer these queries from this scope, answer these queries from this scope. And while, yes, you're reducing your hardware requirements because you don't need two sets of servers, it still seems to me like it's a bit of a hassle. And split brain DNS was always a bit of a hassle because it was a coping mechanism to deal with the presence of NAT. In an IPv6 world, hopefully we don't need to worry about this anymore, and this just becomes a footnote in the annals of computing history, so to speak. But okay, so if you're doing a DNS deployment, one of the things you have to consider is, where are my external servers and where are my internal servers? And those could be two very different things. For, a lot of small businesses, maybe your internal is still your domain controller, okay. And then your external is GoDaddy or Namecheap or whoever your registrar is, because most registrars will also offer some default DNS servers that you can use. Or you might have a specific DNS provider that is separate from the registrar. You can do that too. I talked about that a little bit in my video on domain registrars. So there's some flexibility there, but you need to have an understanding of, hey, do I need an internal view with internal addresses? And if I do, then where are these two copies of the zone going to be hosted? And then another thing to think about, which people often don't, is redundancy for each view. For your internal, you probably want more than one copy of DNS in case that one server goes down. This is part of why Microsoft has always recommended that you have at least 2 domain controllers in every network, which, yes, a lot of places will say, we only have 5 computers. Why do we need a second? Okay, well, why do you need a second domain controller? Fine, maybe it's not something that every single business wants to deal with. I get that. Every business of a size should definitely have 2, because it's not just DNS. If your main DNS server goes away, you can't resolve names anymore. And so even if your internet is going, you can't do anything without DNS. It's just not going to work. So you want the redundancy there, but also think about Active Directory, because if your Active Directory crashes and goes away, or the server gets infected or erased, or who knows what happens to it, now what? Now you essentially have to rebuild the entire domain from scratch or restore a backup. Neither of those are particularly fun. Easier to just have a second domain controller that's running. You can spin up a new machine, join it to the domain, everything will sync, and you keep on going. Ideally, in a business where you need high reliability requirements. So that's internal. External's the same thing. You need to have multiple DNS servers out there. And so most registrars, for example, will give you a default set of 2, sometimes 3. Okay, so you have multiples. Great. How do these multiples stay in sync with each other? In Active Directory, if it's an Active Directory integrated zone, Active Directory kind of takes care of most of that for you, because it's using Active Directory's multi-master replication. Every domain controller rather syncs with every other domain controller within a site. But what if it's not Active Directory integrated? What if you're actually replicating between, let's say, Active Directory and Linux? I've done that. I'm still doing that. What if you're replicating between 2 Linux servers? Same thing. DNS actually has a mechanism for this built in. The older terminology was master and slaves. The updated terminology that we use nowadays is a little less weighty. It's just primary and secondaries. Simple. Your primary server is the authoritative server. This is where you make all of your updates in DNS. From there, the secondaries are allowed by access control to query and download a whole copy of the zone from the primary server, and then the secondaries can host that as well. So that if for whatever reason the primary is offline, temporarily we hope, the secondaries have a full copy of the zone and can continue answering queries in the meantime. That's how it's supposed to work. And going in and setting all of this up is its own interesting configuration task, and maybe I'll show that at some point in the future. In fact, if you ever look at the DNS options on a Windows server, there's a checkbox that's labeled bind secondaries. This is exactly what it's for. I don't know that you still need it, because I think binds had some updates since then, but the option was essentially there to say, hey, Windows, you're acting as a primary server, and you have secondary servers that are running bind. The Berkeley Internet Naming daemon was, and still is, one of the most well-known and widely deployed DNS resolvers in the Linux world. There's an option for that. So Windows explicitly envisions that it might be in a role where it's primary or it's secondary. You can do that too. And so all of the plumbing is there to make it work if the admin decides to configure it. So these are the kinds of things that if you're just doing a normal Active Directory deployment, you probably don't need to think about a lot of it. Your external records will be at the domain registrar. Okay, cool. Your internal domain records will be taken care of by Active Directory. Okay. If you have a secondary domain controller, Windows will take care of replicating DNS, and you're fine. You don't need to explicitly designate primary and secondary because Active Directory uses multi-master replication. But if you're setting it up yourself and you're not using default DNS servers from your domain registrar, you might actually need to think about, okay, where's my primary server? What are my secondary servers? Can they talk to each other? Can I make sure that my zone is actually replicating from one to the other? How often is it replicating? Am I replicating this every hour? Every 15 minutes? What do I need? How much of a performance drag will that be? And then you think about the same thing inside. And you also then have to consider your split view, your split brain DNS. Okay, do I need to resolve my external domain name from inside the network and have it resolved to internal IP addresses? If so, I'm going to need split brain DNS. Either by having some records at the registrar and some records inside, or maybe you want to just set up a single DNS server and you want to do port forwarding into the network so that people outside the network can query your DNS inside the network. That is an option. It's not necessarily one I recommend. There's a reason why, for security's sake, it was always, okay, well, one set of servers on the inside of the network and one set of servers in your DMZ. There are security things to consider there, but this is all part of planning the architecture of the network and making sure that your infrastructure is set up in a way that works for that specific situation. So there you go. There's some of the things that you can and should be considering when you're doing a big proper DNS deployment. If you have thoughts on things that you think I missed, or tips and tricks that you think would be useful, feel free to let us know right down there in the comments section. Also, let me know if you have other things that you'd like me to talk about or things that you'd like to see me demonstrate. I'm all ears for that too. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. I am your next door netadmin, and we will see you next time.